way, and this is the fifth market pattern, is frictionless markets. And this is what I've experienced quite a lot in Silicon Valley when I worked for a research company called Net Market Makers, which was acquired by Jupiter Media Metrics. And what we used to do is track online marketplaces. And online marketplaces is all about taking analog processes, analog products, services, you name it, whatever market, and digitizing it. So what happens is, in this case, okay, you have the size of the market, whatever that is. It's going to be, hopefully you want to pick a large size of a market, whatever that market is, okay, and the we'll call it market W. This really just shows this is a variable. It can be any market. And then what happens is you have a market that's kind of like this. It's a bell-shaped curve, of course. And once again, depending on the dynamics of a particular sector, that bell-shaped curve will vary. But in principle, what you're doing is you're seeing that the processes within a specific industry are still analog. And what's happened is that as the conversion, a natural progression of any market going from analog to digital, all of a sudden a different type of curve comes up, okay? And this is the digital curve of a market, whatever that is, analog, okay, digital. So it's going from analog to digital, okay? And so what you're really doing is you're making the markets frictionless, which means that you're making them more efficient. Because if you're automating or if you're digitizing a process, then you're really doing some really cool stuff by reducing the cost. Okay, so what happens is that when you're reducing those costs, you actually have the opportunity to expand on the market because the cost is lower. So it becomes an amplifier. The lower the cost enables more people, more consumers, more nodes, you can look at it from a network perspective, to use that service. So that's what happens. And so some of the perfect examples is by creating a frictionless market. I mentioned online marketplaces. But another way to look at it is communication. How do you make communication frictionless as much as you can? And of course, the people that have taken advantage of creating frictionless communication obviously is Facebook, okay? Because, and initially it was MySpace, and of course MySpace is back in the game again by segmenting. That's another story, another video I'll talk about. But bottom line is they made the communication between friends, family, and acquaintances much easier. So that's another way to look at creating a frictionless market. Another way to look at frictionless markets is, for instance, from a communication perspective, is Skype. Skype enabled people globally to communicate with each other at the lowest cost possible. So that was another way to build a billion-dollar startup almost overnight. And one of the things when it comes to communication is the network effects come in. And that's really simply, from a complexity science perspective, is that the more nodes that join a specific network, whether it's Facebook, MySpace, Skype, Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever network, the higher the value to the network as well as to each member. So that's one of the components that frictionless markets enable, which is it amplifies the value by having more people come in and interact frictionless. The other example is, for instance, PayPal. Once again, the famous PayPal mafia, and Elon Musk was one of them, at least that's what they call him in Silicon Valley, is that they made payment processing more frictionless. And of course, they were acquired by eBay, and that's what created an incredible exit for all the founders. And one of the things that Bloomberg talked about was that when PayPal was acquired by eBay, ironically PayPal was still losing money, but their acceleration curve and adoption curve of the product and the services was phenomenal, even though eBay at the time had their own service. So from that perspective, they were able to build a billion-dollar startup almost overnight. Another example of it is, in fact, one of my favorite examples, because I actually know some internal stories about Pixar because of some of the people in Silicon Valley, but I won't talk about it. But the cool part is that Pixar also created something frictionless, and what I mean from that perspective is they used computers to develop really cool 3D-like animation, and so, or computer generated animation. And so you had Disney, which was the leader for so many years, and I'm a big fan of Disney. I've always been a big fan of Walt Disney, and he's actually inspired me, is that they were doing it in two-dimensional format, and what Pixar did was they came out and created a scenario of frictionless processes where a computer could become a tool for animators. And what they did was they expanded the imagination of animators, and you had incredible stories like Toy Story come out, and you know, they went from in fact the Toy Story itself created a 12x return for Pixar because it generated about $358 million in revenues, and Pixar in itself, by using computers in their animation process, which obviously made the process of animation a lot more frictionless throughout, is they produced 13 films and generated $7.1 billion in revenue. So that's another great story of a company becoming a billion-dollar startup almost overnight. And of course, the cool thing about Pixar is that obviously Steve Jobs was a key player in that as well. So these are the 5 different market patterns that I have personally seen as a complexity scientist. And I do study complexity science for many reasons. One is inspiration, but the other reason is from a business perspective, because how I see myself, how I see markets, is like they're constantly in a dynamic flux. And I think that's very cool to study it, because to me, markets are like nature. You know, if you look at the history of ecosystems throughout humanity, you have the ecosystems, the natural ecosystems changing dynamically, and at times the change of acceleration is quite rapid. And I find it very fascinating because the markets are like that. So certain dynamics that I talk about here, and I'll delve into it in further series in terms of how to build a billion-dollar startup almost overnight, play out over and over again. So together we're going to be on a journey to figure out all the different patterns. I can tell you there's quite a few more. But the other things I'm going to discuss is in the future is how power law affects the capability of a startup becoming a billion-dollar play almost overnight. And actually I talk about it. I talk about the other thing I'm going to discuss is how power law plays a part in building a billion-dollar startup almost overnight. In some of the future videos, I'm going to discuss power law and how power law plays a major part in building a billion-dollar startup. In fact, I write about it in Entrepreneur Myths, The Startup Reality, one of the books I wrote, and how power law will work against you in creating a billion-dollar startup because it's considered a super hit. But we'll learn how to defy the physics of the power law by looking at the structural dynamics of an evolving market. And I think that's going to be really cool and interesting to study. Until next time.